Welcome to this tutorial on the systems thinking approach called System Maps. This is one of a series of tutorials on methods, tools, approaches and frameworks to support you in your systems thinking and practice. Let's first look at the function of system maps, or what it is that they actually do. Well, first of all, a system map is a tool for thinking and a social object for conversation. What that means is it provides us with a reason to get together to think about a particular system of interest. System maps provide a snapshot of a system at a particular moment in time, or in other words, a situation. They show the structure of a system in terms of the system's components, but they do not show interactions, influence, or causation. System maps are drawn from the perspective of the person or the group constructing the system map, and they can be used for an existing system or for one that is yet to be realized. In other words, a system as found today or a system as imagined at some time in the future perhaps. But what about the purpose behind these particular functions? Well, system maps provide a tool to help develop understanding of a system via high-level, simple diagrams of the situation under investigation. And this helps you to do several things. So one of those is to experiment with and to define your system boundary of interest. What falls within your system and what is outside of it. They help you to focus on your system of interest and to identify hierarchical subsystems and elements within the system boundary. From that point, you can identify relationships between elements, what naturally clusters together. You can also identify relevant aspects of the system's environment which falls outside of the system boundary. System maps can help you clarify your thoughts at an early stage of analysis, and they can also help you to prepare for more detailed diagramming later on using other methods. They help you to communicate to others the basic structure of a system that you're describing. Let's look next at the steps in preparing a system map before I show you an example. The first step is to define the purpose and context of the system of interest. There are two basic methods by which to do this. The first is a top-down method, and here we start with defining the overall system boundary. What is contained within our system of interest for our purpose and from our perspective. Next, we have two related steps which we may perform in iterations. We have the first of identifying the subsystems, and then within each subsystem identifying the elements. And we may flip backwards and forwards between these two at the time that we do this. We then reconsider and revise steps 1 to 4. The next method is a bottom-up method. Here, once we've defined the purpose and the context of a system of interest, we identify the elements at the most basic level. We then group these elements into subsystems. And then we might define the overall system boundary. And again, we'll reconsider and revise steps 1 to 4. Let's provide now an example from my experience of editing a magazine called HUM-SYS-V-SM, which is a magazine on human and organizational factors in operations, primarily in air traffic management, but increasingly in other sectors as well. And here you can just see at the time of recording the latest issue of the magazine. If I start with the purpose of this system map, then I've decided it's a system to promote learning about human and organizational factors in operations via HUM-SYS-V-SM magazine. And now I'm taking a kind of top-down method. So first of all, I've got my system boundary. This is everything inside the boundary from this point is that which I have to really be aware of and can somehow have influence on. My first thought was about the readers. So I need to identify the readers of the magazine, and prior to me taking over as editor, there were already a set of readers which were primarily within aviation, and within that, primarily within air traffic control. But I also know that there has to be a production team. So there needs to be readers, and there needs to be a team responsible for producing the content. I now go to my readers and I look at who they might be. So we have frontline air traffic management workers. So for instance, air traffic controllers traditionally, and also professional pilots. And then there are also safety specialists, which have traditionally had an interest in the magazine because the traditional focus of the magazine was actually much more so on safety. There are also human factors and human performance specialists who are also readers of the magazine. Also some managers, particularly operational managers for instance, but also senior management. And then we have other aviation stakeholders. So we have people in engineering roles, we have people in flight ops roles, and people all throughout the aviation system that might be interested in human and organisational factors in operations. And then I realised that we have other industries. So much of the content of Hindsight magazine is not just relevant to aviation, it's relevant much more generally. And so that's an area of interest where, without too much additional effort, it's possible to have a much greater impact with the magazine beyond its initial, more limited scope. Turning now to the production team, well, of course, you need an editorial team. So there's a kind of editorial subsystem within that. And then, of course, there's authors, because there needs to be content for the magazine, and so we have to have authors producing that. And then the magazine somehow has to be designed, and so there has to be a graphic design team, and it has to be printed and distributed, and so there's a printing and distribution team. Now the physical magazines, but also the online magazines, have to go somewhere, they have to be sent somewhere, and so there's a subscription team as well, responsible for keeping subscriptions up to date. And then there's also the social media aspects, and therefore there has to be a social media team. So this reflects roughly the kinds of sub-teams within the overall production team. So we have readers and production team. But this isn't enough to produce a magazine. I realised in doing this that these were all stakeholders, so I can put another grouping around these readers and production team, that they're all stakeholders in the magazine. Moving on now, there's a technical subsystem. There's also a procedural subsystem, and there's some kind of promotion subsystem to tell the world about the magazine. So if I focus first on the technical side, I realised that the act of proofreading, the task of proofreading, is actually a huge amount of effort, and so there's technical assistance for that in the form of software, and so that's become an important part of actually producing the magazine. There's also technical tools from the graphic design side that are required in terms of software, and then there's the printing technical aspects, and there's also a database, and then there's social media to promote the magazine. On the procedural side, I realised that there has to be writing guidelines, and so those were actually produced to help authors to write content that's relevant to the magazine. And then there's something about contracts, because perhaps there's contracts with external parties in order to produce some aspects of the magazine. And there may also be permissions needed, and so that's something as the editor that I have to think about. And then there's promotion, and the first aspect is via Skybrary, since Skybrary is one of the main places where the magazine is hosted digitally. So that's a website, a wiki-style website. And it's promoted via Skybrary, via social media, and also via email via Skybrary. It's also hosted on the Eurocontrol website, and so that's another thing that needs to be considered in producing and promoting the magazine. There's also LinkedIn, since many readers are actually on LinkedIn and are active users. That's an effective way to promote articles in the magazine and also to request articles, so to produce calls for articles. There's also word of mouth, which is not something that's within my control, but it's something that is some of interest that I can get some information on. And then there are other means, such as Twitter, for instance, which reaches quite a different audience. So this is a magazine primarily aimed at aviation, especially traditionally, But increasingly it's of interest to healthcare, for instance, and many healthcare professionals use Twitter. But all of this needs planning, and so I've added that as another aspect of this system map, another subsystem. So there's a planning subsystem, which is really important. There's planning required for editing, because there's an editing timetable. There needs to be time for review, for instance, and also time for the active editing of each article, which is quite some work. There's planning required for graphic design in terms of deadlines to produce copy. Planning required for distribution and printing of the magazine. And then also for promotion, to keep some kind of regular schedule of promotion. So that's more or less where I got to with my system map for producing learning about human and organisational factors in operations via Hindsight magazine. But there are also things that are not really within that system, but fall outside of it rather, but are of interest. So other magazines are one aspect of interest. They're not part of this particular system, they're in the environment. But for instance, we might not want two magazines to be published at exactly the same time. That might reduce the impact, for instance, of our internal magazines. Other magazines might cover quite similar content. That might be another thing to consider. Then there are also industry developments which are outside of my system but that are relevant to it. So the COVID pandemic and its effect on the aviation industry and also on healthcare, for instance, is something that's of interest to the magazine and therefore something to pay attention to. Other examples might be new regulations. Now, when you're drawing a system map, you may find that it's useful to just draw it without all of the internal bubbles, especially when you're drawing on a screen such as this one and you don't have access to a room with paper and so on. So this is perfectly acceptable way so long as it's clear. I'm going to focus now on the editorial team because, particularly from my role as editor-in-chief, I need to know who's in that team, who's participating in that. So I'm going to expand that into another set of blobs, if you like, within the editorial team. So there's the editor-in-chief, which is myself, and then there's the copy editor, which is a role that increasingly doesn't exist so much in magazine production, and in this case, both of these are myself. Then there are reviewers, and those reviewers may have roles such as controllers, pilots and engineers, and all of those are particularly important to the primary scope of the magazine, which is human and organisational factors in operations. There's also a cartoonist, also part of the editorial team. So it's necessary for me as the editor to keep in touch with all of these different people and also all of their planning requirements. I'm particularly interested in how this magazine might be of help to other industries, which could give it huge added value for no to little additional cost. So let's expand that a little bit. Well, I was initially thinking that healthcare is one example of an industry for which this magazine will be useful, and since issue 25 there have been articles from healthcare specialists, for instance, which are of value not only to other healthcare specialists but are of value to aviation readers and readers from other contexts. Then we have sport. This is also particularly relevant because of the reliance on human performance and the knowledge that exists within sports about human performance that could be relevant to pilots, to air traffic controllers, and to those in especially high pressure, high tempo activities. And then there's a software industry which is becoming increasingly relevant also to air traffic management, and lots of good things around human and organisational factors are going on in software development. Then there's sectors such as firefighting and other emergency services, where again you have high risk, high tempo, high pressure work that's of interest to the readers. Also perhaps the energy sector as a safety critical sector, and perhaps other sectors that I need to think about a bit more carefully. When you're conducting your analysis to prepare your system map, there are two basic ways to do it, and one is using just nouns, as you've seen in that example. So these are just things in the system or in its environment. So LinkedIn is an example of that. Another way that some people do system maps is by combining verbs and nouns, or functions and things. So functions that the system has to perform to achieve its purpose. So in this sense, I might write promote via LinkedIn. This could be useful as a way of doing a very early task analysis, but on its own it's not sufficient. So it could be useful to perform this analysis using verbs and nouns, but then convert what you get into some kind of perhaps hierarchical task analysis, if that's what you want to do. Whichever way you choose, it's important to be consistent, and I tend to stick to just nouns as system elements. Let's move on to some organising tips for producing a system map. The first is to get the right field expertise together, either physically or using whatever app you prefer to use, and up to 7 or so people is useful for this. If you have more people than that involved, then you might want to consider having them break into different teams to perform mapping for the same purpose, and to see how the system maps might differ between those two groups. Sticky notes can be useful for in-person groups, or you can use a digital equivalent. For instance, you can use breakout rooms and then drawing tools for each of those breakout rooms. Continually reflect on the purpose, the boundary, the subsystems, and the elements within the subsystems. Whatever tool you choose to produce your system map, it will need to have the flexibility to enable you to do that. And then to also define the life cycle stage. So is the system map for something that's in the conceptual design stage or the detailed design stage, or is it something that's in operation? And consider perhaps the system as found today before going on to consider the system as imagined or as you are proposing it to be. And plan for about an hour or so for the activity. And then finally, some creation tips. So as you saw in the drawings I prepared earlier, just make the system boundary visually distinct so that you can see where the boundary of your system of interest is. Typically with this method, blobs are preferable to boxes, and that's quite typical of the method, so it doesn't look kind of like an engineering diagram. Try to avoid overlaps between the blobs and avoid partitioning blobs as well. Focus on elements such as equipment and not properties of elements such as reliability. Try to put important components in a fairly central position, because that will tend to indicate some kind of importance to people, and try to put related components close together. Remember that readers may well perceive that blob sizes indicate the relative size of the elements, so just pay some attention to that. Leave some white space as well. That gives you some flexibility, and it also makes it easier on the eye. And as I mentioned earlier, it may be easier not to use blobs for the lowest level elements, especially when you're doing this digitally. It just will give you probably a bit more space to work with. That's all for this tutorial. I hope that was helpful for you. System mapping is really a basic method. It's one of the earliest or first methods that you might use. So until next time, I'll say goodbye, and I hope that's useful. See you again.